Thank you, Kim. When we consider Monica Morgan's comment about landscapes that shape us and landscapes that are shaped by us, and we move to peri-urban landscapes are primarily constructed landscapes. We shape them. And the debate about peri-urban landscapes is really about the type of constructed landscape. So the huge disputes that are happening are really not about natural landscapes. There are elements of our peri-urban landscapes that are still pretty intact. And if we look at Melbourne, the Border Works catchments, I think, are a really good example of a long-term policy commitment that has preserved that original landscape pretty much intact until fires that we light or that otherwise encroach on those landscapes. And there are pockets of landscape, of original landscape around, but basically these are debates about constructed landscapes, and they're very important debates because these landscapes around cities, peri-urban, around that area on the edges of urban areas that extends maybe 150 kilometres away from the edge of a city. They're the areas we're talking about. They're critically important for the future functioning of cities themselves. I think really this century, the cities that protect their peri-urban areas are probably going to be those that survive best, given enormous change that's going to happen. So they're complex socio-ecological systems. They're affected by a huge range of circumstances that we don't have time to go into today. The main one really is these urban pressures, and different cities around the world cope with these differently. A lot of cities, such as United States cities, have this gradual movement of enormously varied urban-related activities moving into these peri-urban landscapes. A lot of European and other cities have hard edges to the cities, and they've done a pretty good job in protecting those human landscapes that we define as green belts. So there is a lot of variation, but that massive urban pressure is the basic pressure on peri-urban landscapes. It's like a wave that rolls over. There's lots of global influences that we don't have time to look at, technological workplace change. There's regional policies. We've had no real regional policies in this country. We've had a few pseudo ones, but we don't do regional policy well. 2/3 of our population live in the 5 capital cities, and the capital cities are getting a greater percentage of the increased population. There is some movement in that area now, but it's not anywhere near enough. Environmental change of the type we're looking at today is just going to be absolutely fundamental to the future of these landscapes. And what I really want to talk about more though today is the national regional policies around land use and the political and cultural change. I really want to focus on this issue of land use expectations as a cultural impact, as part of that socio-environmental bag of influences and circumstances. Land use expectations and rules are fundamental cultural impacts on the future of peri-urban areas. They basically define in a legal way what we do on private land and what we can't do. And what we're not doing as a culture, and our politicians are certainly not doing this, is looking at future scenarios. What do we want to happen to these peripheral urban landscapes? So I really want to have a look at some business as usual scenarios. If we do nothing, what is going to happen to the peripheral urban landscapes around Melbourne? And I want to just scope out very quickly alternative futures. If we don't want this future that is basically already mapped out, the future is determined by the rules we have today. The present is determining the future of these landscapes. If we do nothing, we know there are going to be these futures in 50 years, 30 years. If we don't want that, what do we have to do? What new rules, what new cultural expectations do we have to put in place to avoid those futures, and what kind of futures do we want as an alternative? Now, we're not doing any of that. If you talk to politicians, if you talk to landowners, a local government, nobody basically is doing that kind of thinking. If we look at local government, they run the local planning schemes. We've done an enormous amount of work with peripheral urban, peri-urban councils in Melbourne. They just roll on basically. They're years behind re-examining their planning schemes, and I just want to have a look at some of those impacts very quickly today. So if we start off around Melbourne, we have really dire cumulative impacts. Every time Melbourne and cities like Melbourne across the world expand outwards, they expand into peripheral urban areas. Melbourne is one of the worst examples of this in the world. We had a legislated urban growth boundary in 2002, which, you know, in my old age naivety thought this is really going to force fundamental change. All that happened is that the development industry and the two major political parties conspired together to expand it, to keep on doing what we've always done. It changed nothing. As an example of a rule and a cultural change, it was a rule. It didn't have any impact on the cultural expectations of the critical groups, the landowners, the development industry and government. So it was a monumental failure. And the impacts on biodiversity are huge here. Melbourne expands into some remnant, very important remnant areas, as you know much better than me, the western grasslands, for example. And we can see around the Dandenong Ranges and so on, it's been much more successful. And the Yarra Valley in those forest areas in preventing development. And the constructed landscapes around agriculture are hugely impacted by this too. We've basically lost most of our, or all of our peripheral urban agricultural areas that formerly were providing Melbourne with food, and we're now spreading out to really important agricultural land. If you look at some of this gross value of agricultural production land above 5,000 returns annually per hectare, I mean, this is really big stuff. It is very productive. The area around Melbourne, for example, is the second most productive agricultural region in the state, and we treat it as if it's land in waiting for urban development. And we have these multifunctional landscapes, and one of the big debates about peripheral urban areas internationally is by people pushing very hard to turn these landscapes into multifunctional landscapes, including a series of urban uses, such as major tourism uses or hobby farms or further land fragmentation, lifestyle properties and so on. Now, we can talk about multifunctional landscapes excluding those urban functions. And if we look at these rural landscapes, they are multifunctional. Most of our constructed landscapes are high quality landscapes. They're valued very highly by people. Even the open areas are valued. And green belts themselves have always been valued for their own sake, that is, as non-urban areas. So there are a range of uses and values associated with these constructed rural landscapes, and they're multifunctional. The big debate is to prevent them being turned into a much broader definition of multifunctional uses by including these urban related uses. Now, if we look at the particular peripheral urban area around Melbourne, we can see that we have the urban growth boundary, the inner green belt, and this outer area extending up to Ballarat, Bendigo, the beginning of the Trobe Valley and Geelong. About 700,000 people live in that area, and it is increasing at about 2% a year. And when we look at that land use pattern, what we find is an incredibly fragmented landscape. There is an historical legacy that is really, the past is determining the present and the future. It is extraordinarily fragmented. So in that outer urban and inner urban, peripheral urban area on that map that I just put up, there's about 87,000 vacant lots or lots that are capable of being subdivided under current planning schemes. And this fundamentally, if this is allowed to occur as a business as usual outcome, this will determine a future that will fundamentally ruin most of the attributes and values of the peripheral urban area around Melbourne. And this is true of every other Australian city and many other cities in the world. We look at this historical pattern, this fragmented pattern, and it's absolute. It's the Americans call it this crazy twist of land use, and you see somebody's been able to subdivide small lots here, some hobby farms here, and there's still big farms, and there's in the middle of all this there are sort of 25 hectare lots, and there's 80 hectare lots, and it's complete jumble. Nobody has rationally worked this out. It's just happened. So the question is, what do we do about this? If we don't want this future, and it is a bad future in every way, it removes agriculture. It fundamentally affects biodiversity because about 30% of the land parcels in Melbourne's peripheral urban area are 40 hectares and above, and that's where most of the remnant habitat is and most of the remnant biodiversity is. If we allow this fragmented pattern to continue, it will wreck the remnant biodiversity. But the problem is that much of this is already subdivided. Our figures included subdivision, but about 2/3 of this is already there. What do we do about those existing subdivisions? So we know what this is going to look like, costly fragmented landscapes, and basically doing nothing is not an option. So we've modelled the pressure on this outer peripheral urban area, the pressure on these landscapes, and it is dire. Over a 30-year period, when we look at the dark colours, the brown are the high pressures, and they're along the major transport corridors to our regional towns like Ballarat and Bendigo, particularly Bendigo, but around the periphery as well. And when we actually drill down and have a look at the parcels, we've actually looked at the land parcels here, and they are often on areas of high environmental value, both landscape, biodiversity, remnant habitat, and also of agricultural value. And if we break this down into the natural environments, as we have, and overlay them, there's very serious impact. So if we look at this, drill down into a particular part of this, we looked at 8 municipalities in this peripheral urban area, and we just looked at some of the scenarios, continuation, which we've quickly looked at, and what kind of alternative scenarios. So just very quickly, to look at the scale of the problem that has to be looked at, it has to be considered and acted upon. The planning provisions that exist now are just badly matched to land characteristics. So the strongest rural planning control is the least used. The rural conservation zone has some fairly tough controls. It is hardly used. The environmental overlays are poorly matched to the environmental needs, and so are the zones matched badly. So if we look at this across some of these municipalities we examined, the farming area, the farming zone, this one is the one that is fundamentally used right across that rural area. And that's because it's the weaker zone. It allows most uses to occur. It has very poor environmental controls. And it's just applied very generally. If we look at the overlay use, we look at this planning scheme that we have, and there's all these overlays that can be used. The problem is councils have not selected the environmental overlays that are best suited to protect environmental values. And if we just look at the vegetation protection overlay, it's this dark one. The only council in this case study region that uses it to any significant extent is Macedon Ranges. There's a little bit in Ballarat, but basically it's just not used. There is simply no control over vegetation removal in rural areas over most of this area under the local council planning scheme. There is a state government control, but the vegetation protection overlay. The significant landscape overlay is the strongest zone, is the strongest overlay, and again, that's hardly used. So if we look at where houses are going, they're going right across the landscape. So these landscapes, because they're so fragmented and people are able to get permits on small lots in rural areas that you drive along, you think this is an open landscape. It's not. It's subdivided, and gradually, incrementally, thousands of houses are being built. They're being built right across the landscapes with huge implications for the future. Now, what do we do about this? Well, if we don't want to have a future that is determined by these current conditions, there needs to be strong intervening policies of an alternative kind. We modelled a couple. They're not used anywhere. They're minimum subdivision control, minimum dwelling size requirements. So, for example, you might have a requirement you cannot build a dwelling on a parcel less than 25 or 40 hectares. And that fundamentally fixes things. It reduces rural development, if we adopt that, from nearly 50,000 to 5,000. This 5,000 is still a lot. It's a large area of land, but it fundamentally reduces the dwelling entitlement. Tenement controls used to be used. They're controls over the number of dwellings that owners of jointly owned parcels. So a farmer might have 10 4-hectare lots on a 40-hectare property and just wants to sell them all off, and you stop that person doing that by allowing them to only have one property, and that fundamentally reduces the number to just a few thousand. Now, a few thousand is still probably a few thousand too many, but this is an example of how 87,000 dwellings entitlements can be reduced fundamentally to under 10. And the kind of landscape differences, when we model this, we look at the pressure on development in these landscapes. The blue is even low pressure and the darker is high pressure. And then when we look at the difference in the future development potential in these landscapes from these alternative policies, they really make a huge difference. They fundamentally alter the future trajectory of landscape change through dwelling construction and through development. And I've just put two next to each other here. Basically, they fundamentally alter the way landscapes are going to look and function. So to finish up, what we've argued is a series of integrated policies for rural and township development, which really fundamentally concentrates future development into the townships and within the boundaries of the townships. This is Kyneton. There's a huge amount of land in every single one of these townships, large and small. And what's happening? They're not developing it. They're not developing integrated policies on varied housing types with much more affordable variability of housing. They're just subdividing land on the fringe. And you can see this in West Ballarat now. This is huge. All through the Trobe Valley. It's easier just to keep on rolling out the Melbourne model of peripheral urban change, and this is what's happening. And yet there's all this land. So we modelled this and found there were 62,000 additional dwellings capable of being constructed within the current boundary. Just want to finish up. Kim's going to kick me off in 1 minute. We modelled the Dandenong Ranges for land use, and we found that councils and governments had done a pretty good job in trying to prevent future development in the Dandenong Ranges because of long-standing policies by adopting low-density residential zones, basically zones that don't allow additional dwellings. These are tough controls that go back to the Hamig years, and they've been pretty well maintained, but last year the government changed the zones. The councils had done a good job putting the best zones as the best fit in. Very unusual in Victoria. The council changed the zones to allow multi-unit development right across landscapes. So all that brown area is now allowing multi-unit development on the fringe of the Dandenongs. And this is going to have fundamental change impacts. And just to finish up fire, on fire, one of my favourite topics, fire in the peri-urban areas. The government Some years ago, after the Royal Commission allowed the 1050 rule, you can clear basically without a permit understory and vegetation. We modelled what might this look like in landscapes around Upwey and the Dandenong Ranges that have got an incredible tree cover extent, but they're fundamentally subdivided into quarter-acre lots. Would this mean a loss of trees? So that's the tree cover now. Applying the 1050 rule, every tree virtually goes. Right. And when you look at where people are building houses, this is post Black Saturday in the Marysville and Kinglake West area. The red is where it was burnt, and people are building, have rebuilt in those areas, those little blue dots, exactly where that occurred, and this is what is going to happen. So unless we make these decisions about the type of landscapes, the type of social and cultural expectations and rules that affect these landscapes, we are just going to go on with a business as usual trajectory to our great peril.